My last video got some criticism, quite fairly in my opinion, for not considering alternate modes of dealing with the dead. So today, we're going to consider some weird and wonderful ways of engaging with the corpse, continuing our Halloweenish series on death and world building. This time, we're talking about magic that can speak with the dead, and various potential cultural responses to that. As usual, I'm going to be extrapolating generally, but starting from D&D, which admittedly has a very strange method of primarily contacting the dead. If you stick around to the end, though, I will offer some thoughts on animism and seance in terms of talking to the dead as well. So, speak with dead. It explicitly states that the body's soul does not return. A corpse that's under this effect is able to converse through its animating spirit. First off, this indicates that in D&D we have a complex system of metaphysical embodiment. The body is provably separate from the mind, the soul, and this animating spirit. Feeble mind destroys the mind and nothing else. Phylacteries and devils trade in souls alone, and an animating spirit is presumably what is severed if a creature's silver cord is cut through on the astral plane. But putting that aside until I inevitably make a video on it some point in the future, what this means is that a corpse can learn or process no new information, and only can discuss things that it knew in life. This means that an ancestor-worshipping society who keeps the bodies of their ancestors around, either all year round, or in specialised delineated celebrations like Dia de los Muertos, can keep a rich and permanent oral tradition, as long as the bodies still have mouths to speak with. Such a culture is not only less likely to forget its history, it will also be able to utilise the expertise and the skills of long-dead savants to some extent. While in D&D we cannot ask corpses to speculate, imagine, or create with the modern world in mind, in fantasy more broadly, this may be a rich and very rapidly developing culture indeed, having simply access to more brainpower per capita. But back to D&D, I can see a culture that makes the effort to protect and preserve their ancestors' bones so they can gain ancestral knowledge to head in one or two clear directions, and it largely depends on who gets preserved. History is messy, cruel, and filled with things being lost and forgotten and ignored. Most human cultures throughout our history have classes of people deemed undesirable or unworthy. It stands fully to reason that such groups may not be preserved as carefully as kings or generals. I mean, even the bodies of those were lost in foreign fields or by simple negligence. If a culture is selective about who's preserved in a speakable to state, then we risk prejudicing a certain view of history, one written by the victors or the highest caste, or perhaps even a history where certain groups' involvement is willfully erased, as the records of the dead that we have preserved don't match these fanciful tales of your culture's heroism. Think on the people in Britain whose grave sites we know. Yes, in modernity, most burials are marked. But in history, well, we mostly just have records of where the great men of the past are or were. Determined, of course, by cultural perception. No, speaking with corpses is only really a useful tool for creating oral histories if all corpses are honoured. Here we look once more to the Day of the Dead for some inspiration. While some selection does occur on the ofrenda as to which ancestors are right to be displayed, we can take the notion of having remembrance and record keeping of the dead done by each family, potentially with some elements included of the macabre, making those sugar skulls into perhaps the real skulls of ancestor laid out in a physical family tree, so that the dead can be conversed with whenever there is someone who can cast such magic in town. This way we tend to lose less of the received wisdom and less of the oral history of a culture. Perhaps clerics are actually employed mostly to trace back lineages by asking corpses about their parents, their grandparents, and the burial places of both, to map out this comprehensive web or network of the dead. Then Masamune can be consulted on his techniques, Sun Tzu mined for even more specifics, and Shakespeare asked about what the heck his works mean. But in my opinion, such a culture would move away from the great man theory of history pretty quickly, as these greats of history may start to cast a smaller shadow when we hear the voices of everyone else, or perhaps they just turn out to be arrogant, obtuse, or a hack. I can envision a culture that honours its ancestors, keeps bodies around, and makes diligent records to build a collectivised view of history. One which sees a tapestry of disparate but related folks engaged in the process of life, viewing themselves and their modern time as a simple step along the road. It may be quite a refreshing way to build a fantasy culture. Holy relics have been important for all of Christendom, for almost as long as Christianity has existed, and probably for humanity an awful lot longer. In a world playing by D&D's rules, it's very likely that we see heads as an even more critically important relic type than even in our world. The head, after all, contains the mouth, and eventually contains the skull. Now, I am choosing to interpret the spell Speak with Dead liberally here. You need a corpse with a mouth, which are both not terribly specific terms, so I tend to allow skeletons who have jawbones to count. It makes the world far more interesting to be able to talk with ancient bones. Although if you are a stickler for the rules, you can get around most of these requirements through mummification and pickling. My point is, their head becomes, in this looser interpretation at least, the most critical part of the body for interfacing with the dead. And so we should turn to ritual practices regarding the head alone. It is likely that for the ease of movement of ancestral bodies, decapitation may become a common practice, especially as, well, many execution methods in our own history have a very similar result. So, banks of skulls, probably cleaned, are likely to find themselves a common way for people to preserve their ancestors. It's much more efficient than lugging around a whole body or a whole skeletal corpse, and has the added benefit of not really making it very attractive for necromancers to raise the dead if they got no head. But I'd also like to propose an alternative. The indigenous people of South America have practiced crafts with the fat from human faces for generations. They are boiled and shrunk, placed around small objects after the skull is removed. With this practice, a person can feasibly carry dozens of dead heads around, each which has a clearly visible and usable mouth, as per the spell's description at least. It is likely that a faith might spring up amongst those who have the power to speak with the dead, where practitioners may carry around their entire ancestral line, or survival experts, naturalists, or folks with niche knowledge as a library of life-saving information on their very person. This would work really well for itinerant or ascetic religious practitioners. Such an oral library may eventually develop into a physical structure where thousands of shrunken heads are placed, their knowledge accessible if you have that divine gift of speaking to the dead. If we have slightly more space, another fascinating and flavourful preservation method are seen in Paris's catacombs or Prague's Sedlec ossuary. Building bones into municipal or communal structures is another excellent way to retain access to such individuals' old expertise in a society less squeamish about the dead. Imagine how many historical injustices may be solved by asking the skulls in the catacombs just 5 questions. Now, this has all been assuming that the culture at hand wants to keep bodies which can later be used to communicate with the dead. If this is considered taboo or necromancy, or the culture is uneasy with the notion of bodies animated by spirits alone, there are tons of ways to ensure that this never happens. You can feed it to animals, especially hyenas and jaguars, or any number of beasties in a fantasy world who are willing to eat everything. You can dissolve bodies, cremate them, or more pricily, disintegrate, shred, petrify or pulp them. But if your concern is specifically avoiding the abuse of speak with dead, and not preventing almost all forms of reincarnation and reanimation, there are some very interesting options. In cultures that place sacred value on the corpse and its preservation, they may develop strategies to prevent reanimation and speaking with the dead. Sealing the mouth shut is one simple change, often in use in fact in the creation of shrunken heads. Or we can look to the superstitions of Eastern Europe and so-called vampire burials, where scythes or blades are placed above the neck, so if the corpse were to rise or sit, its head would be lopped off and there would be no reanimation left to do anything. This could develop into more subtle expressions, using sharp wire ensnared around the neck and tied to the ground below, or coffins that are going to immolate if opened, blades set to remove the jaw in a single strike if it even so much as moves, or balloons of acid caught between the teeth of the dead so that if the mouth moves, the whole thing dissolves, or pouches of gunpowder rigged in the mouths of corpses in a rising escalation of paranoia, drama, and vindictiveness. Alternatively, perhaps such a culture has to deal with the fact that they must needs remove the jawbone in a ritual preparation of the dead. Heck, maybe the removal of the jawbone is the foundation of a novel and interesting ritual practice among some cultures that really don't want their dead talked to. I promised animism and I promised a discussion of seance, so let's do it. Sky burials are a fascinating funerary practice, most famous in Tibet but practiced across South and the middle of Asia. The body is seen in these cultures as empty and unnecessary for preservation, so it is given instead to the land. Most common in mountainous regions where it's just hard to bury a body in the ground, this practice has some real merit when it comes to preventing speak with dead. Firstly, the location of the corpse as a whole, as bits are carried away by all sorts of wild things and the wind, is unknown to everyone. There is no marker, and no necromancer will ever know how to get to that corpse. Now, most of the cultures who practice sky burials are not explicitly animist, but it is worth considering this in a fantasy context where animals can be talked to as well. It is possible that feeding a corpse to nature is a way to ritualize the transition of the animating spirit into the world, the release from the body. Perhaps through the initial feeding, these birds and beasts can take on aspects and memories from the deceased. So instead of collections of immobile corpses being our ancestral map, we have a living, natural ancestral map in the world around us. The seance is also a really interesting thing to think about. Speaking with dead in D&D, as I said at the start, is weird. You need a physical body, but that's not how we always conceptualise of the dead. Many times, ghosts, spectres and spirits are perceived to exist in actuality beyond the body. Strangely, or perhaps not so strangely, Speak with Dead has a limited time and limited number of questions, much like most depictions of the Victorian era seance. In my opinion, Speak with Dead should be usable as a ritual in a place inhabited by restless spirits, without a body needing to be present. It should carry some risks, much like Contact Other Plane, but this would seem fair for eschewing this specific material component. Now, can seance work easily in fantasy with such often complex and dynamic ensoulment being part and parcel of the system? Basically, we already have much of the groundwork into which seance was born as a cultural practice. We have spirits that, in fantasy's case, are provable and in the world, nasty murders, and restless ghosts in haunted old manors. Much like in the real world, it is likely that a ritualised seance practice is developed as a lay alternative to the drastic and dramatic way that priests and people like that often interact with spirits. It's a way for folks with no divine power to effect the same potential using the latent magic of the spirit world. Maybe in some cases the ritual is gifted to people by a devil, or perhaps by an agent of the divine. A society where the lay can call spirits in this limited capacity may develop very differently indeed from what we might expect, or may lead to unfortunate results where a truly vengeful spirit slaughters a chanting circle of unpowered lay priests. This would be a really fascinating tale to tell, a ghost and its ever-chained circle of hopeful dead now do-gooders, struck down by the very spirit they sought to aid. Or the practice of seance could take some work off the proper priest's shoulders. Perhaps they stop needing to focus on the people of society and can focus solely on the divine, while a strong community of lay spirit channelers run the day-to-day aspect of the faith. Either way, I feel seance is remarkably underserved as a story beat in fantasy. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this fascinating, or at least found a nugget of this that you're going to be able to take into your own world building and extrapolate on from there. Again, please do let me know in the comments if you have any thoughts sparked by this, or any thoughts of your own that are related to this spell or any other that I might want to cover. I love extrapolative world building and thinking through the consequences of what these things do in the real world, and if you love that too, make sure to give me a subscribe so I know exactly what you want. So thank you for watching. I hope you're ready for another spookily themed discussion next week. Speaking of next week, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungin Master, and I will see you in the next one.